Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin, our tour through my Penguin Classic wall, book by book and author by author. And today's author is squarely in the theme of Victober, BookTube's venerable and renowned celebration of all things Victorian. This is Elizabeth Gaskell's novel Cranford, which is really a group of fictional sketches, not so much one carefully gestated novel. Those sketches appeared sort of willy-nilly in the early 1850s. At around the same time that Elizabeth Gaskell was writing one of her more unreadable, gigantic Victorian triple-decker, utterly humorless, leaden pieces of fictional creation. I think a book called Ruth. There is a cult of Elizabeth Gaskell. It is very well represented on BookTube and very well represented at Victober. And maybe it's a cult that needs me as a member. Certainly, none of its blandishments have ever worked to convert me. There is a cult that says that Elizabeth Gaskell is the Victorian writer, that she is the Victorian novelist, and books like North and South or... I've never heard anyone champion Ruth, but probably there are champions of Ruth on BookTube. Her big, blockish Victorian triple-deckers are often hauled out as examples of that, and in response to that kind of estimation, I'm always just happy to hold up this book instead, because this book is just pure delight. It is just a purely delightful... I mean, there are serious elements involved, because Elizabeth Gaskell was a grind. But she wasn't as much of a grind as George Eliot. You'll always have that. In fact, everyone in the world will always have that. There'll never be anyone who can't say, well, at least I'm not as much of a grind as George Eliot. As long as we're throwing dirt in all directions during Victober. There are, of course, serious overtones. This Penguin edition collects all of the moving bits and pieces of Cranford and is edited with notes by Patricia Ingham. If I remember correctly, her introduction is one long funeral threnody about one of the most delightful books in the English language. So I don't know what to do. If I'm remembering that introduction correctly, I don't know what to do with such things. Such treatments of books like this spring exclusively from the bowels of academia, which is why I fled that realm as fast as I could, and why I don't advise that anyone ever study English literature on the academic level. Don't ever do it. Because it produces treatments, super serious sociological treatments of, the darkness of Cranford or whatever. But the stories themselves involve a mythical little turn-of-the-century village, or mid-century village in England that's right up the railway, just 20 miles away from a big industrial city, and that is starting to be infiltrated with the mores and the mannerisms of the modern world. A familiar theme in Victorian literature, where suddenly train lines were encroaching on the most isolated, bucolic little villages, where suddenly manufacturing and industry were becoming the norm rather than the exception, where little villages that had their hedges and their parish and their 100-year-old curates and their house gardens were starting to feel threatened. They were starting to feel that a larger movement of society was endangering them, or worse, mocking them. And there's a little bit of both in these Cranford stories. There's a little bit of endangerment, and there's a little bit of mockery. Elizabeth Gaskell is utterly charming in these pages. I mentioned that this is a pure delight. This is a book that gives pure delight. And I have sometimes had... fellow critics of mine, fellow friends of mine in the course of 50 years or whatever, I've sometimes had fellow critics, usually general readers don't do it, but I've sometimes had fellow critics say, well, isn't that a condescending thing to say, a mere delight, a pure delight, that a book is a pure delight? And I always want to say to them, try it. Try to produce that response in readers who've never heard of you and don't know anything about your literary tradition. Try to write even a single page that produces that response in other people. It always drives me crazy when that kind of writing is dismissed almost as readily as funny writing is dismissed. Both are incredibly difficult to do. incredibly labor intensive to produce on the page. They take a huge amount of skill. And the only people in the world who don't seem ready to credit that are literary snobs, the kind of literary snobs that populate academia from stem to stern. And that is one of the reasons why I left academia, was either that or a massive career in serial homicide. So when I say that this book is a pure delight, that it is a delight to read, I am not calling it mindless. And I'm not reverting to the kind of snobbish attitude towards English literature that has, I guess, is its assumption that creating pure delight is the default setting of English letters, and that you have to try real hard not to do that. That of course you're going to produce real delight because just falling out of bed will do that. One of the many Victorian readers who loved these stories as they were appearing was John Ruskin, who never, in the entire course of his writing career, created delight. You have to work real hard to be delighted by anything that Ruskin wrote. I know, because I do it on a regular basis. But he liked these stories, and it was in correspondence with him that Elizabeth Gaskell revealed a little bit, it seems to me a little bit shamefully, that she also, when she pulled down the book, took delight in rereading these stories. It's my own intention. It's my own intention that the stereotype of Victorian men and women of letters, super corseted, super serious, huge triple-decker novels that have no glimmer of life in them. That stereotype is, of course, not true. As I've said on this channel many times, the Victorian era, just soup to nuts, is the most incredible, bursting, inventive period of human existence, in my opinion, and I think I can back up that opinion quite amply. And the stereotypical big, woolly Victorian monsters, in terms of novels, in terms of books, even nonfiction, almost invariably, when you start to read them with an open mind, they reveal that they are alive and just humming with inventiveness and daring and thoughtfulness and insight and all that sort of thing. The one thing that they sometimes tend to lack, I think it's the reason why this element is so overpraised in, for instance, Dickens, is playfulness. And that is maddening to anyone who has studied the Victorian era, history, biographies, especially letter collections, because inventiveness was everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. Especially in the creative world of the Victorian era. The long Victorian era. It's everywhere, that kind of playfulness. And that kind of playfulness characterizes this book and is almost surgically absent from almost everything else that Elizabeth Gaskell wrote. So I can sort of understand why someone would think that. I mean, if you look at Anthony Trollope, for instance, a Victorian author that we know well on this channel, if you look at something like Orley Farm, which is big and weighty and miserable. Or if you look at something like He Knew He Was Right, which we were supposed to do a read-along of this month for Victober, you look at something like that, and aside from the rude mechanicals that Trollope almost always hauls into his narrative in order to lighten things up a little from issue to issue, aside from that, you will not see a glimmer of playfulness. And you might, if you look at those books from afar, or maybe haven't read them, seen how compelling they are, you might think, well, that's because no one in the Victorian era was capable of playfulness. And, you know, even when it comes to Trollope, who could be a little on the ponderous side, just look at Barchester Towers. It has the exact same feel to it as Cranford. That exact same sense of an incredibly serious and incredibly capable writer who's deciding to have some fun. And again, I point out, I want to stress here that the author having fun on the page is not the same thing as producing a sense of delight in the reader. I have read so many books where the author is clearly having a ball and the reader is bored to his eye teeth. Same thing is true in the Victorian era as is true now. It takes a huge amount of talent to produce the effect that Cranford has on the reader. And that effect is pure smiles, just all around. You might think, in your more academic moments, you might think about some of the ways that this book reflects on the fact that the world of Cranford is clearly endangered and dying. You might think that, and there are, I guess, PhD theses to be written on such things by people who have not taken the proper amount of medication. But the main impact that you'll have here will be that this is just an author having a great deal of fun by presenting a parade of semi-ridiculous figures and just letting them be ridiculous. I want to read you just a bit from the famous opening of what we now consider to be chapter 1. I won't read too much, but this is an idea. This will give you an idea of what's going on here. In the first place, Cranford is in possession of the Amazons. All the holders of houses above a certain rent are women. If a married couple comes to settle in the town, somehow the gentleman disappears. He is either fairly frightened to death by being the only man in the Cranford evening parties, or he's accounted for by being with his regiment, his ship, or closely engaged in business all week in the great neighboring commercial town of Drumble, distant only 20 miles on a railroad. In short, whatever does become of the gentlemen, they are not at Cranford. What could they do if they were? The surgeon has his round of 30 miles and sleeps at Cranford, but every man cannot be a surgeon. For keeping the trim gardens full of choice flowers without a weed to speck them, for frightening away little boys who look wistfully at said flowers through the railings, for rushing out at the geese that occasionally venture into the gardens if the gates are left open, for deciding all questions of literature and politics without troubling themselves with unnecessary reasons or arguments, for obtaining clear and correct knowledge of everybody's affairs in the parish, for keeping their neat maid-servants in admirable order, for kindness, sometimes dictatorial, to the poor, and real tender good offices to each other whenever they are in distress, the ladies of Cranford are quite sufficient. A man, as one of them observed to me once, is so in the way in the house. And as the book begins, so it will go on. I defy anyone to come to that opening, that pure bravura opening, and not smile. And that is the whole point of today's Penguin Classic, which is, oddly enough, a continuation of these absolutely must-read works of English literature, so that are in their own way pure delights. Natural History of Selborne is a pure delight. Testament of Youth is not, I don't think you could call it a pure delight, but it is a pure book. It doesn't have any gross or lesser matter in it. It is a perfect execution of what it tries to do. Same thing with this. So your Penguin today is a recommend. I'm not 100% sure that I would recommend this particular Penguin Classic. There's probably a delightful illustrated edition. There were period illustrations of Cranford that were wonderful. There's probably a delightful period illustration of this that's out there somewhere that isn't the Penguin Classic. So in this case, I am more recommending the book than the edition. But oh my, am I recommending the book. Read it right away. Put it on your list. You don't have to stop reading Victorian literature when Victober is over. After all, you can keep reading Victorian literature till the cows come home. All of it is in public domain. All of it is on Project Gutenberg for free in perfectly curated and nicely formatted editions. And that includes both the nonfiction and the fiction. Try little Sir Charles Lyell. Give it a try. For Nonfiction November, another venerable booktube tradition that's coming right up. It's right around the corner. And if you're loving Victober and you're loving your experience with the particular brilliance and confidence that everyone in this era evokes on the page, and you don't really want to leave it, well, you don't have to. You could devote Nonfiction November to the nonfiction of the Victorians. Anyway, I'll nag at you about that at a future date. I'm going to wrap up your Penguin now with just a strong recommendation. I don't know what other videos I will make today. I'm getting the strong sense. The last few weekends, the Earth and all the planets have crashed down on my head. Almost on a timetable on a given Friday, and just stayed that way for all weekend. It's happened so many times in a row now that I'm actually starting to dread weekends. Totally irrational as that is. These are, of course, random chance. But if this weekend turns out the same way that the last, what feels like the last 150 weekends have, then I might not make that many videos. But I couldn't let today go by without a Daily Penguin that celebrates Cranford and its Amazons. So I'm going to wrap this up for now. But I'll be back, I hope, if not today, if not this weekend, then certainly Monday. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.